Thanks for being with us tonight. I want to start with Susan. Let's jump right in. Tell us about your company, about what you do with content marketing.
Yeah, I'm Susan Moeller. I'm the marketing manager at BuzzSumo. BuzzSumo is a content marketing platform that helps writers, content creators to understand what their audience wants to know more about through the lens of social shares. And we do that so that content creators can decide what resources their audience is interested in and what resources will continually draw people to their site, both for information and purchases.
And Susan, you said you work predominantly with B2C companies?
Oh, predominantly with B2B. Yeah.
B2B, I'm sorry, you did say that. Yes.
Yeah.
Katya.
Hi, I'm Katya Libin. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Hey Mama. Hey Mama is a community for professional women in the workforce, specifically for moms. Our mission is to make mothers more successful and help them navigate their personal and professional growth by connecting them online and off with connections and collaborations. So everything here is very near and dear to our heart. We started off really strong in content, and we've since evolved into a content and membership model. But originally that was really how our platform was born, and we create about 5 to 10 original pieces of content per week online, and then a significant social presence to connect with our members in 7 to 10 cities across the country.
When did you launch?
2014.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Sharon Fetter. I'm the Chief Content Officer at The Muse. If you're not familiar with The Muse is building the best place to research companies and careers. And what we do is we work with employers to help them through a series of tools understand who they are in the world, right? What is their employer brand? And to help them tell that story. And then we help users understand what are they looking for in their career. And through those two things, we help both sides find fit. Because to us, it's not about the best company, it's about the best company for you. And everybody has their own experiences there. So we've been around for about 7 years, and content means a lot of things at The Muse. We do B2B content, and we do B2C content. And so we have lots of different forms of content that we'll talk about more.
Thank you. Peter.
I'm Peter Brooks. I'm interim VP of marketing at VM Group, but I actually have a consulting firm where I go around, help different startups, usually in the A and B series stage, help them develop their marketing org, help them with hiring. So really go in there, build the infrastructure, and get them on their way. Work with brands like L'Oreal, work with brands like Entertainment Studios, Textio, and I'm a former muser.
He's my buddy.
Sharon, you said there are lots of forms of marketing at The Muse. Tell us about what is the definition of content marketing, or what kinds of channels does that cover?
Sure. So lots of different types of content. So when we think about content from a user perspective, right, we're thinking about our audience and what they need in their careers. And that can be articles that are reported in depth to help them understand, I hate my job, what do I do now? Or what does it mean to find a new job if I truly care about LGBTQ? Really sort of diving deeper into modern workplace issues with a really fresh voice. And then from a career search perspective, what we're doing is we are going and working with companies to really understand what they do, what their culture is like, how that culture differs between one office to another, from one function to another, and then helping to articulate that through profiles and articles. And so as a user of The Muse, you can read articles, you can go on profiles, and you can better understand and visualize what a career could look like there. And of course, many of us have experienced job search, and it can be incredibly frustrating because you just don't know. And so part of what we do is create the content that helps to answer the question, what could this be like? Am I a fit? And then when it comes to the employer side, when we think about B2B, we're creating that content with them, but we're also doing B2B lead gen content. So we're creating the content that we know our buyer is looking for. And the great thing about those two audiences is they tend to be looking for very similar things, right? They care about the modern workplace. They care about sort of understanding what they need at this point in their job. And so much of the time we're creating the content that speaks to that need.
Susan, when you work with B2B companies, what is the scope of content marketing? To me, it sounds very high level in general, and so I'm curious how, in practice, people actually define the scope. Is it just articles or more?
Yeah, so I define the scope. I think when I think about content marketing, I think of it as in a hospitality metaphor. People come to your site, so they've come to you, it's inbound, and content marketing has a touch point wherever they interact with your website. So the website content is part of that, but the blog posts that you write are probably a larger percentage of the content marketing that you need. So content marketing is a whole package of what you present to people who come to your site. And of that, once the site is created and set up, then the blog articles are those things that continue to drive traffic, to earn backlinks, and that in turn will help your site overall to rank well.
So, and I'd be curious, Peter, to hear your thoughts on this. It's the content on the site, and then there's kind of the art of how you promote that content. And can you kind of tell me about, how that works in practice? You have, let's say, article or profile on your site. What beyond that is reflective of kind of the practice of content marketing?
Yeah, for me, I look at content marketing as articulating value to a prospective client. So the way I go about it is figuring out where these people are. So if I know a user is on a specific platform, how can I package up the content and how can I create a compelling, story, compelling headline to get them to interact? So across the board, I utilize a lot of tools on the search side. Then also looking at social trends to figure out, what are the conversations people have, craft content in a way that's going to be appealing to them and deliver it to them. So whether on the paid or the organic side, we match intent, we match the intrigue of that prospective user.
And I'm just curious, when you're building out teams, to just go in the weeds here for a minute, when you're building out teams, does the person, the kind of, I'm being overly simplistic, but the person who writes the article and manages the article, are they on the same team as the person who promotes it on social media? Is that all part of one content marketing team, or the person who manages the SEO, or does that tend to be more distributed across the organization?
Actually, I like to have that group work together. So in the ideation phase, when we figure out what are the themes and concepts we're going to speak about, we would have somebody on the SEO side doing the research.
Yeah.
So pulling that information in, so saying, hey, these are the keyword opportunities. We have the opportunity to rank here. Then working with the writers, the editors, the content marketers to go ahead and package that up and put it in a format that's going to match the intent of the user.
I think this really differs company to company. So especially when you're more early stage or startup, you're not going to have the benefit of lots of employees or teams. I know in a lot of the companies that I've worked in, one person is sort of learning this on the job and figuring it out and asking people like Peter for lots of advice and coffees. And so on these teams, you might think about how do you learn the basics of SEO, the basics of social media marketing, of paid distribution, so that you can incorporate it into your strategy when you're creating that content from the start.
Katya,
Yeah.
I want to ask you about day one in building, because Katya, you said you started as a community, which you presumably built from content marketing, and now you're a membership business thriving. What was day one, month one? How are you taking this on?
Yeah, we've come such a long way. We actually started on Instagram. We originally just had an Instagram account and a splash page, really just to test out whether the concept even resonated. So we were so scrappy. We're still bootstrapped 4.5 years in, so I could really speak to building a content marketing strategy with $0 and then what it looks like now when we have just one person that manages all content, all social. It's really lean. But that's allowed us to kind of navigate quickly and see what worked. And for the first month, I remember we just weren't growing. This was on social. This was back, 4 years ago. Instagram was a different landscape at that time, but something just wasn't working. And then we found a formula for us that really worked. And for us, that was showcasing mothers and their kids and talking about what these women's professional aspirations were beyond motherhood. We found a formula, we stuck with that on Instagram, and then we launched the web content about 6 months later, got to about 10,000 followers. And that's where we started really seeing a huge opportunity with how we used event, social, and blog content together. So almost all the content we do is 360. We'll use our members to create and originate the content. Since we have a wealth of incredible, intelligent women with so much to share, we don't have to necessarily pay for it because these women want the exposure. And then we'll amplify that through Instagram stories, live takeovers, Facebook Live, and that might culminate in an event. So for an example, we'll partner with QuickBooks on a series where we tap into QuickBooks customers to show how they're actually using the solution. And that will happen on editorial and IGTV. And for the brand, they're super excited because they want to reach small business entrepreneurs, and it really comes to life in a way sexier way than normally QuickBooks can.
Yes. I want to stay with you on that for a minute. To be clear, when you launched, you were a content company, but using solely Instagram.
Solely Instagram for the first 4 months, I'd say. People were like, what is this? And we really didn't know. We were saying we're a community for, working moms, and we were still figuring it out. We started meeting and interviewing with hundreds of women literally through Instagram. We would DM them and get on, Skypes and ask them what was missing and what they were really craving out of the community. And over time, the content seemed like the next extension. That's when we realized we had a lot of opportunity to tell great stories and connect women in real life. The membership came 2 years later. So the first 2 years were all content creation and brand building. And like you said, just establishing a really clear voice, because there was a lot out there, but we found a huge gap in brands that were speaking to this modern woman that wants to grow her family, grow her business, and grow her legacy. And that's where Hey Mama was really speaking to her.
I think it's a really important point, the way that you launched. And I'm sorry, I keep going back to that, but it was either so brilliant or intentional, or just a heck of a way to beta something. And I think, we had so many questions in the pre-panel survey, and thank you everyone who filled that out. It's so helpful. So many questions about how to develop this massive trough of content on a lean team. And there is a case to be made for that not being necessary and other ways to test the direction you're going.
Well, we just had no money to work with. And I think that's the reality. We just didn't have it. So
Does anyone have no money to work with here?
Yeah, we just didn't have the resources to hire someone to do it. So luckily, my co-founder was an editor at Hearst. So she came from an editorial background. But using Instagram to at least hone in on your voice and your image style and how you connect and build a space. And then we bought a WordPress template, which I swear must have been a good one because people thought our website was custom for literally 2 years. They're like, who built your website? And I said, we bought a $99 template. And they were shocked. So I think there's a lot you can do to be lean, but the good imagery and the really strong voice together was original enough where people were like, okay, this is something I want to pay attention to.
Yeah.
And there's so many people out there that want to share great advice and resources that will do so happily for the right mission.
Yes, we know. We have 4 of them sitting right here. Susan.
Yeah, I was thinking about both of those models, thinking about a larger team and pulling people together in the ideation phase, and then on a smaller team, which I would say BuzzSumo has been. And both of those, I think, emphasize the importance of thinking about how the content will be distributed before you create it. And I think that's a key part of success in content marketing, simply because there's so much content available. And over time, if your audience is already saturated with a lot of information, then I think distribution strategies become even more critical. And something like having users create for you has other people invested in your content from the beginning. So I think that's a huge piece of the puzzle.
Can you speak to any, and I'd be interested from the other panelists as well, kind of early stage content marketing, whether the companies you work with or a company you've run yourself? How did the Muse, how did some of your clients, or and Peter as well, take on these first days of content?
You go ahead.
Okay. So Peter was there before me. So I actually asked our founder, Catherine, our co-founder, Catherine, to tell me a little bit about what she did in the beginning. And, Catherine and Alex, her co-founder, are such hustlers. From the beginning, they went to lots of events and they did lots of things and they met people and they forged really critical relationships. And one of those relationships was with syndication partners. So going to larger publishers and talking about syndicating Muse content onto sites like Forbes and Mashable, and getting, much larger audiences, introductions to the Muse. And that became really helpful much earlier on for things like SEO, right? So I think a part of, when we think about content marketing and being like really early is where are the places where it would be really helpful for you to have, exposure. Of course, the content landscape is much, much, much busier and more saturated than it was 7 years ago, but there's still lots of niche spaces with key audiences.
Yes, Katya.
Oh, I'd agree with that. I'd say one of the early hacks we did is we'd have every piece that we posted on Facebook, like our 5 closest friends would share it immediately. We would literally text people and be like, okay, new post is live. Make sure you share it on your Facebook page, because their algorithm would kick in and it would start going to a wider audience. And so that engagement piece with any content you do publish, whether it's like your mom and your grandma that are going on and commenting on it, it's important to get people engaged in your content. And then I think that rewards it super well, both on Instagram and on Facebook.
Right, and it might not get you to 1 million views at first, but the first 500 to 1,000 can help you figure out how to get to 10,000. Yeah, Susan.
Yeah, our story is similar with our founders. I was the first employee at BuzzSumo, so I've been there, I think, from 5 months after the launch. So I wasn't a founder, but I was there at the beginning. And that was really the strategy, was meeting people in the industry and forging relationships and partnerships with them. It also has the advantage of not costing a lot. And a tip for that is go to a really great event, and then you can meet lots of key people at the same place. But that was a part of our story too, and I think is a great strategy still.
Yes.
The thing that's been really helpful from the content side, outside of partnerships, which are great, we actually have had a few of them that have been helpful, but the email newsletter is probably the most quintessential part of a successful content marketing strategy, because you own that audience, and a successful strategy to grow the list in tandem with the content is what we found to actually get real eyeballs on it. So it's a completely other topic, I'm sure, another panel that we should do here, but email acquisition and growth to support the content.
And I would say that's really critical now more than ever, right? Because like a couple of years ago, you would go on social and you'd have like so much more reach organically, and you're just not going to get that now, both because of the algorithms and saturation from other brands or competitors. And so like actually owning your distribution, I'd say, is more key now than ever before.
Staying with that, just Katya, a quick question there. You said you launched on Instagram, and it wasn't until 6 months later that you had online content. Mm-hmm. So where did a newsletter fall in the timeline?
From day one. We had a splash page from the Instagram that said sign up to get updates. So it was pretty much, instant. And then we used a lot of sweepstakes and other growth marketing from email to grow our list. It's now at like 125,000, but that took 4.5 years.
Yeah. Peter, what's your, the other panelists have been talking about partnerships and syndication, and I think it's a great tactic, but if you're launching, you probably don't have a lot to offer. So why should why should Forbes take stack list content, for example, or how do we convince them if we don't really have the followers or the key metrics that people often look at?
I think it's the value in the content. So identifying, what they're trying to accomplish. So what I normally like to do is target certain writers, certain editors, and figure out the type of content that they push out. And I try to assess who that audience is and figure out where the gaps are. And, from day one, I provide value. I say, hey, I have a slew of content that's going to resonate with this type of audience in this particular way. So off bat, first email, you're getting value. I'm going to save you a hell of a lot of time. Then a lot of the content, I remember, early days at the Muse, Catherine and Alex built this reputation of having great content that spoke to this audience. So what we had to do as marketers is really, sell that value. Always be selling. Go out there, and just show how valuable you are. And think about it. Everybody that works at some of these big companies, they have a huge workload. So how can you make it easier for them? And I think that's the way in, and that's going to be the way that you win.
Yeah. But so you mentioned Forbes. I know this is kind of brand specific, but what are some other partners that have kind of proven successful just to help crystallize this?
I think it's interesting to look. I know I just said not to look at platforms have changed. I think which platforms work for you, right? So an example would be we're talking really right now about thought leadership. And so which platforms or publishers are right for your thought leadership. And that really differs brand to brand. So I'll give you an example. One of the interesting places where I see thought leadership is LinkedIn. But, other examples would be in the consumer space. You might be providing thought leadership to a consumer publisher. I think it really depends, the audience that you're trying to target. I would say, thinking beyond syndication, because syndication also can be saturated. You want to think about maybe where can you publish original content? I think original content is really interesting to different kinds of publishers for different reasons, right? They might get the value of you driving SEO for them because you're providing something original to them. And so you might want to think what is that value exchange that would incentivize them to want to work with you beyond voice and beyond thought leadership.
This might be a silly question, but what's original? What is not original content?
So when we talk about syndication, I would define it as maybe, for example, I'm publishing something on my own website, and then I'm providing that content to another site for them to publish as well. And they might include something like a canonical link so that, and he should be selling you all of this, and so that, you don't get dinged on SEO, right? And that indicates to Google who created it first and who should get the credit for it. So when you're syndicating, you're taking what you've already published and you're giving it to somebody else, and they're going to do the same thing with it and hopefully give you the credit. When you're providing something original, you are giving it straight to them, and they're the first to publish.
Got it.
We did something recently at BuzzSumo that I think illustrates this really well. And BuzzSumo has a lot of data about the types of content that resonates with people. So we've developed in the past 6 months 2 content partnerships. One with Backlinko, which is an SEO-focused blog. And what we brought to the table was data. What Backlinko brought to the table was audience. Brian Dean, who works with Backlinko, created and published the post using our data. And then we paid for advertising to send traffic to his site, which in turn fed back to BuzzSumo. So it was a kind of a value exchange. There was no real cash involved other than our paying for the promotion, but it paid off incredibly in terms of new trials, traffic to our site, and a valuable backlink.
Yeah, and I think you could think about that in lots of ways and lots of products, right? So, for example, webinars. You'll find a lot of B2B companies in the space doing webinars to acquire the right users or clients. But what you often see as a tactic is for one company to partner with another company so that they're acquiring emails and then sharing in that database. And that way, each party is bringing new relevant content to the table and each getting something out of the partnership, hopefully.
I want to talk a little bit about content creation. And again, I would just want to go back to as early as you can think, Sharon, the first, or I guess Peter too, the early days of the Muse. how were you creating the content? Was Catherine writing it? Were you writing it? Who was writing it? And how did you kind of determine the cadence of content that you wanted?
Yes, I wasn't there that early, but I can tell you, Catherine and Alex did contribute. Alex, one of the co-founders, has written some just incredible productivity content if you're ever interested. And then they had an early editor, right? And so they would have the editors and writers writing and editing very early. You might think of that as one early employee. Some at the time, contributors to the site, adding their own expertise. You go.
So, pretty much when I got there were a few editors there, and, they had, a reservoir of content already. What I then provided was, hey, we create so much content, but it's not really hitting. So how can we be very surgical and figure out what the right pieces of content are to write and when to write it and what time to write it? So thinking about distribution strategy, so in the ideation phase, we say, all right, we want to speak about a particular topic. Who are we speaking to? Where do these people live? Are they mainly on social? Do we already have a huge email list that we want to push this content out to? Do we want to partner with other partners in the space? So that's going to dictate, how you create the content for those particular channels.
Yeah.
But yeah, distribution is key at the ideation phase, and it helps us, create content quicker, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And we can get it out there, and we can see results a hell of a lot quicker.
And I could tell you, now, when we think about content, especially because the landscape has changed so much since the early days, we're thinking about, well, what kind of content is this? Is this social first content? Are we creating this just for social? Are we creating this specifically for email? Are we creating this for search? Understanding how are we going to make this successful? And first and foremost, how does this meet the needs of the user? Across all content, one of the things I try to really talk about a lot is, if we weren't getting paid by this company, would we read this? I feel like it's such an important litmus test. Would you as a person, as a human, want to read this and interact with it and probably share it?
Peter, I want to come back to one of the points you were making. So in the ideation phase, you come in and you say, I think that, X channel is the right distribution. How does that kind of work backwards? Then how do you say, what should that mean to me as your writer or editor, that you as a marketer say, this needs to thrive on X channel?
Yeah, so usually I provide the best practices for each particular channel. So, right now I'm working with a brand. They only have 2 writers. They don't have that much content. And we need to make a big mark in the industry. So the thing I'm doing, I'm starting looking at all of their competitors, seeing what they rank for, seeing where these competitors are strong and weak. Then I can identify where we can move in. Then I'm also utilizing social listening to monitor conversations that each one of these brands is having, with their audience, and also targeting certain influencers. Now I know what the lexicon of the space is. I know what these conversations are. Now I can provide, hey, on social, people are asking this particular question.
Yeah.
And there are not that many resources out there for them. So let's create this content and pose it in a way that is going to match their question with the particular answer within this piece.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's essentially how I break things down. So looking at every particular channel, I always think about audience. I look at the historical data, and luckily with tools like Bright Edge and some other tools in the space, you can get that real-time data to see, what these cohorts are speaking about.
Katya, it sounded like you might say something.
I was just thinking more about those, the scrappy tips for the early stages. And obviously, depending on your business, one of the ways that we created content was interviews. And I don't think that interviews are necessarily going to be your slam dunk home run on SEO. But in terms of getting content out the door, if you need, some content to stay consistent on your schedule, tapping into influencers or women that you feel are influential, or men. We just happen to feature a lot of women / only women, generally mothers. Sorry about that. I think we might need to interview some dads for Father's Day. If you are in the audience, please come to me.
The site is called Hey Mama, in fairness.
Totally. But we have done Father's Day content now that I think about it. Interviews are a great way to find people that really embody your brand. They're going to be hopefully flattered by the fact that you want to feature them. They probably will have high-res imagery because they might already be at that place where they have a collection of images that have them, showing their lifestyle or their business. And then figuring out obviously how to, subject line it and title it so that it's really compelling. But that's for us how we were able to get so much content on such a scrappy budget. And then on the promotion side, we didn't have the big distribution. So we were really leaning on these influencers with 100,000 plus followers across these different channels or 1 million Pinterest followers that would then spread the word. And that was a lot of relationships and being like, hey, please support us. Can you post about this? Can you post about it everywhere? Can you post about it again? We really appreciate it. But it was priceless. And having those people really speak to your brand, I think can be a part of a good content marketing strategy.
So looking back, we know this worked for you and it was successful, but you didn't know that when you started doing it. So what was it, how long did you have to kind of sustain a drumbeat before realizing it was effective? And what were the clues that it was effective?
Well, for us, the main objective from the content was to inspire women to see a path, right? Like we can't build these amazing businesses if we don't always see who's done it before. So the main objective for the content originally wasn't necessarily reach. It was about the people that did see it to feel like they could understand exactly how these moms built and scaled their business. So it was a very specific interview. How did you do it? What were the challenges you faced? A lot of the questions we're asking here, but from brands that you would know and respect, to hopefully create a library where a woman thinking about starting a business could find another woman that has done it and say, she has 4 kids, she started this business, now it's, Dry Bar and it's a $100 million business. That's pretty cool. How did she do that? So I'd say when looking at the analysis of whether it was successful or that drumbeat, traffic-wise, I always feel like we could be stronger, but content-wise, people constantly tell us that the content really moves and inspires them. So it depends on, is this your business model? And we quickly realized that we were not going to be building a Refinery 29 in terms of traffic. And so we pivoted from a media model to a membership model. And now the content really serves the purpose of telling our community stories, inspiring our readers, and then also introducing our thought leadership to brands and partners that want to bring in community into their workspaces and help moms feel more connected in the workforce.
And I think it's important to also, are you self-funded or did you raise venture?
No, we've never raised, but we are raising now.
Well, there's something to be said for that. And for when you say a more surgical approach, that's often something that companies that do not take venture funding get to do. And granted, it comes with a slew of other risks and hazards, but it is a different channel. And I think areas like this are areas where it makes a difference, where you don't have to launch the strategy that immediately yields 100,000 email addresses and just cross your fingers that that's the right strategy. But that I appreciate that point. And I want it to be clear to the audience too, that like venture versus not venture plays out in things like content marketing and things like marketing strategies. Susan, your companies that you work with, what is the creation like in the B2B businesses? What is the ideation phase?
So what I've seen in terms of ideation is people researching the types of content that have performed best in the past. So looking at the social channels where most of the engagement takes place, looking for other publishers whose content is already getting a lot of engagement, looking at length of content, types of content, and developing from that a checklist really of what is working for a topic, then looking at what is working for their audience, and then comparing what's working with their competitors, and using those 3 data touch points to identify gaps, like you mentioned, and learn best practices from what you see and what's performed well. So that's also the process that we tend to follow at BuzzSumo. We know that really long form content is what people respond to. 3 to 10,000 words. Go team. But that we pretty much don't do a lot of short form content because it doesn't have that same value in what we see our audience responding to.
And how do you produce it?
Well, I write it. No, I'm just kidding. I have, I guess being there in the early days, I've done a little bit of all of it. We've just now moved into hiring some of our content creation. So for a long time, most of the blog posts were done by me or one of the founders. The posts that have worked best for us have actually been built on a lot of data. We've seen in some of the research that we've done that if you can do original research of some kind that's relevant to your audience, that type of content is like a very quick catapult into authority. And so it works with our audience too because they like really long form stuff. So we have pulled hundreds of millions of blog post titles and run them through a data analysis software to find the 2 or 3 or 4 trigrams in the headlines that get the most engagement. So for us, I would say our content creation process is quite cumbersome. I kind of laugh when I hear people say, oh, I work 3 hours on a blog post. And I'm like, well, it took me like 3 months, but I also had to learn R, to analyze my data. So
doesn't that scare you though? Because we do recaps of our panels, and the recaps right now still take us probably 20 hours. Not the recaps you'll get tomorrow morning, but these decks. Mm-hmm. It takes a lot of time.
Yeah.
And we don't know that this is actually good. We know it's going to be good for our audience. Great. We don't know that it's going to actually yield kind of the time we put into it. So how do you know that it's going to be worthwhile? And what makes you confident about investing that time?
Well, the first time around, it's a hunch. It's let's try this and see what works. And the second time around, you have good data to go on. So we look at traffic numbers, we look at conversions to trials, and actually people who who even using last touch attribution, people who went from a blog post and paid for a subscription to BuzzSumo, we track that now. And so the first time around, I do think it was just kind of that magic hunch where you're like, I think this is a need. We have the resources. Let's do it. And by resources, I mean we had the data and the time and a lot of determination. So now we have data that says, yeah, that's actually performing quite well for us.
And was BuzzSumo venture-backed?
BuzzSumo was not venture-backed. So privately funded, bootstrapped, founded in 2014. We were separated at birth. So we were not venture-backed at that point. And I think that made a big difference in being able to take that risk and try those content types. I do think too, the more saturated your market is with content, you have to look to higher production value pieces. Mm. The 2-hour list post is probably not going to cut it in a very saturated content market. So you can either look to a smaller niche, like you said, or go big.
Yeah, I think that's very important. So, I work with a lot of bigger brands, but I'm actually personally trying to start something now. So I'm starting something in the travel space, and it's really just me and another former colleague. So we have to prioritize building the platform, creating the content, figure out where the audiences are. So, we have our initial hypothesis. So I think all of you as, founders you have a good hunch of what's going to move the market. And you need to figure out what what the incubation phase is. So, I usually have, I work in sprints. So I try to test something out, try to distribute it, on social, see what the appetite is of a potential user base. And if it's valuable content, I take note of that. So I'm not going to win on the first couple of pieces I put out. But, I want to be able to get the learnings going forward. Now, piece 2, piece 5, piece 10, these pieces are going to start resonating with a larger audience.
What is the sprint framework?
So just it's a
I know
kind
I'm
of like a
making it sound very
development.
formal, but like when you apply it
Yeah.
to content marketing, what is Peter's sprint
Oh yeah,
format?
so pretty much. So every week, sometimes I have an elongated sprint, but it's pretty much you develop your hypothesis, you create the parameters around it, then you go forth, dole out your task to the team, you execute on it. Then our incubation phase. So if it's a week, if it's 2 weeks, we're going to be collecting as much data as possible, checking in, then coming back to it later on.
So you would base this around like one article. So one article would be this sprint, and basically all of the analysis, you would just run a very proper process on this piece of content.
Well, it could be one article. It could be a cluster of articles. So I'm doing something on cheap travel now, right? So I'm creating a bunch of pieces that speak to, different markets. So it's essentially similar content that we create, we distribute it, and I want to see how can I break into a certain market? Can I break into the New York market? Can I break into the DC market?
Yep.
Atlanta market? Then, looking at the effort put out, I say, all right, New York is going to be a hell of a lot easier. We have this many advantages. Then, going to the next sprints and, looking at my meso cycle in terms of planning, I'm going to put my attention in a certain area.
Yeah. Sharon, what are the operations around writing and content production right now?
Yeah, so content means lots of things to us. So we do a range of content ranging from photos, video, lots of different kinds of video, infographics. I mentioned on the B2B side, we have webinars, we have articles, we have different kinds of article formats. You mentioned earlier, you have a range from listicles, which might be like a really short time commitment, to like thoroughly reported, deep pieces that take weeks. So, some of this content, if you think about operations, an infographic requires a significant time commitment and resourcing, right? So you might do the research for it. You might hire a freelancer or do it in-house and figure out what's the story you're looking to tell. You're probably playing with data a little bit. And so that's sort of one part of it. And then you have to think about design. So how are you designing this? This could take weeks for you to put together. If you're doing this for your own content marketing, you might be going internally and thinking about, does this fit our need? How, again, from the start, you're figuring out how are we distributing this before it's even created. If you're doing this with a partner, you're talking about a longer period of time, right? Making sure it fits both of your needs.
Well, can you go into basically how do the articles get written?
Oh, okay. So if we're talking about article, you're thinking about, one, what does the user want? You can think about, this is what we know about our user and this is what they're looking for. And I might have a brainstorm, or if I'm in a formal editorial team, I might have a pitch process, right? You could have external freelancers pitching, you could have internal staffers pitching to figure out what's the right thing for us. And you're gonna have a few things that you think about, right? One is voice. Does the piece of content I'm creating meet our voice, our mission, the needs of our user? And then what is the format of this article? I might create an outline. So kind of like when you're writing an essay, you want to have a sense of where you're going, a little bit more structured. You create that content. That can be in-house, again, freelance. You have the template for it.
Actually, stay on that for a minute. So you have in-house writers,
Yes.
and then do you have other people outside? So people who come from
Yeah.
different platforms?
So we have a freelance network. So we hire professional journalists who have worked in the space, who understand, for example, modern work. So really thinking about who we are as a company, we want experts. So we want experts who understand and have thought leadership, so that when our users come to our site, they see that we're investing in our content and that we're differentiated, right? I think when you think about content, there's lots of ways you can tackle this. You can write in-house, but you can also work with external people who might have expertise that you don't have or don't have the bandwidth to commit.
Do you think that people at an early stage, like the first month or a first year, can do that?
I think it depends on how important the content is to you and whether or not you have the budgets allocated, right? If you were creating a campaign and you just want to test the waters, you might be able to, like, you definitely are able to sort of prioritize this if it meets your needs, right? But you may decide you want to try it in-house and see how it works. I think it really depends on your expertise, whether or not you feel comfortable writing, whether or not you have staff that feels comfortable writing. I think it's very dependent on the company itself.
Katya, how do you and your co-founder still write most of the content, or who does?
God, no. No, I've actually written a bunch of pieces for Hey Mama, and I love writing. It's always a great way for me to really communicate straight from what I feel our mission is, and then I have our editor edit it. Our content team's always been pretty lean. It's been 1 to 2 people at most. And now it's really about storytelling to drive to our big conversion metric, which is membership. So we're a membership-based business, and our content will have HubSpot pop-ups on the bottom that will drive you through the process. So if you're reading an article about an upcoming event, you can say, it will literally pop up and say, struggling with balancing work and motherhood, want to get events like this, subscribe to join us at our next event. And I think that HubSpot, there's a bunch of free levels of HubSpot, and then you can kind of scale up from there. But that platform overall, if you really dive into it, is probably pretty transformational for many on the content marketing side, would probably be my first suggestion. But from an ideation phase, it goes through a pitch process. So our members will pitch us every day on different projects that they're working on, different collaborations. We'll have a mom that was just on Shark Tank, and she wants to talk about that experience. And those pieces perform really, really well for us because we'll time them with when her episode goes live on Shark Tank. We had a mom recently that has gone under a lot of attack for a restaurant here in New York City called Lucky Lee's. She's one of our members, and it's been everywhere. So that's something where we can choose to connect on something that's like really hot in the news about one of our members and see if they want to be featured on an interview. And then from there, it's really, send us images. We send interview questions. We map that back to SEO. We tag it on the site, and it's pretty much done all with one person. Then it's distributed and amplified across, all of our different channels and brought to life ideally with Instagram stories and a really personal storytelling of like, why should you go and read this?
Do you do paid advertising for your content?
We have done some of that. Yeah, we've definitely driven to specific pieces that we really want to get amplification on. But for us personally, paid ads to our actual conversion page seem to work better. There is a point where you need to just bring in so much more traffic in the top of the funnel. A lot of our community is membership based, so they know what we are. They just kind of need to hear about it from a lot of different people to then realize that they should be a part of it. And the content really just supports that storytelling of like, who is this woman and what she's struggling with. The one thing I'll add is first person essays. Some of the best performing content we've ever done has been first person. And also some of the worst content we've ever received has been first person, just from a writing caliber standpoint where it's been so many hours of editing, and then some people just have a knack for it. So if you're going to go that route, I would suggest just working with people that really do enjoy writing. This isn't their first time doing it, something that feels really natural and authentic to them.
You mentioned HubSpot. Peter, what are some of the tools that you like?
So when it comes to web forms and interstitials, I look at a lot of tools like Cordial. So they integrate email and email capture. Sumo is a really low-cost interstitial. But pretty much my top 5 tools for content marketing, ClearScope. So if you have an SEO strategy, this is going to be a research tool, and it's also going to allow you to optimize your content. It actually reads your content, and it's called ClearScope.
We'll send this out tomorrow as well.
Clearscope.io, I believe. But with that, it allows you to run through your content, see what your competitors are doing, all in one dashboard. and it tells you the common terms that are used and what the likelihood is of you ranking if you embody this type of content in your piece.
What are the other four?
The other four, Bright Edge. I'm a huge proponent of Bright Edge. That's kind of like my SEO cheat sheet. So Bright Edge is great on the research side. Now they just launched a tool that allows you to look at YouTube, look at images. So anything that you could potentially search, Amazon, you can look at the competitive stack and you can figure out what content is resonating, who created the content, how long the content's been out, and they give you recommendations on how you can break in. Then, other quick ones, deep crawl on the, kind of like site QA.
Can you just say the rest?
Okay.
I want to make sure we hear what other people's tools are.
Deep crawl and Dojo Mojo if you want to do collaborative promotions.
Great. Yeah, Susan, what about you guys? What tools are useful?
Yeah, so I use SEMrush for SEO. I love that they send me organic rankings every Friday morning. I look forward to that. I do use BuzzSumo, our own platform, a lot. We use MailChimp for our email distribution, which has been great. Those are the three I think that we use in our content creation process predominantly. Oh, Canva I've used for images, both free and paid. And there's also a site called Pablo Buffer. It's Pablo by Buffer. I use that as well for kind of resizing images. And in terms of optimizing your site for load speed, I love tiny PNG. So nothing goes to our site until it's been compressed. And then when I'm bored with compressing, it goes on once it's under a certain number of kilobytes.
Does anybody use the online marketplaces for writing and writers?
We've worked with Express Writers before. They're great. They're virtually based, and I have had an incredibly great experience with them. And I've also hired people through Upwork as well.
We source most of our own writers, and that's just because we have over time developed, a working relationship with lots of writers and are looking for very specific things in terms of areas of expertise. I will say, while we don't use them specifically for that purpose, Contently is a really good resource in terms of content marketing advice that I might recommend checking out their blog.
That's a great idea. I want to ask you guys, what are your key, Katya started mentioning, kind of talking about conversion. Susan, what are the key metrics you're kind of looking at when you ship a piece of content?
Yeah, so I look at social engagement first, and I tend to look at how a post is performing on Facebook. If it's performing well, then sometimes I'll do paid ads to increase the impact on Facebook. After that initial 1 or 2 day period, and I'm looking at other social networks too, but the only one I really pay to advertise on is Facebook. So I start there. Then after a couple of days, I look at traffic to the page itself. And then I begin to look at backlinks and how the content's performing over time. If I don't think it's performing well enough, then I'll wonder, okay, is this one I'm willing to let go, or is this one is there scope to improve it? So recently a piece I thought was a great piece of content, it wasn't getting as much traffic. I went back to my content partner and we created a video interview just talking about why we created it, launched it again on social, and the metrics looked better.
Video, audio, you mentioned, what's your experience been?
Yeah, it's great. Do it.
Do you just apply the same rules as written content, or do you distribute it differently?
Well, I distribute it in much the same way, but I do try and think about. I I try and have for each idea, I love the best practices that you talked about. So take a content idea, have your best practices in mind, and then try and use that content in more than one way. If you do a webinar, that's an audio. If you do an audio, translate it, that's a blog post. And so, yeah, I like to think about which of those is the best. And anything you can do with video, I think, is great, especially on social right now.
I think when we think about video, we're thinking about where is this video going to live? So especially when you think about video platform and where people consume video, it's very different audiences, right? So if we're creating something that's on site, it might be a little bit different than what we're putting on Instagram. And especially if we think about Instagram stories versus an Instagram traditional post versus YouTube versus LinkedIn, right? versus Facebook. So really thinking about what do we know about our audiences on those platforms specifically? What do those audiences expect natively on those platforms versus on our own site, for example?
Last question I'd love to hear from everyone. What are the trends you see happening in 2019 and 2020? What should be 2020? What should people be looking at and trying? Peter, let's start with you.
Put me on the spot. For me, I think, there's so much opportunity in the video space. So, a lot of brands I work with, which are, very small startups, if they have the budget, create the video, speak to an audience, break that content up. But some of the trends I see, Google's starting to promote YouTube so much more. And, there's so much opportunity in the video space. And the fluctuation in rankings, you don't see this in the organic search space. You don't really see this even in the social space. So I've seen the most personal kind of like increases on the YouTube front. But yeah.
Right. Thank you. Sharon.
So I think for me, it's two things. So one, we talked about earlier, which is like owning your own distribution. So like putting really big emphasis on like owning your own email list, creating content specifically and making it really smart. In a lot of cases, personalized. The other thing that I'm especially excited about is just like employee advocacy. So like the bigger your startup grows, like putting your employees to work, strategically having them market the content that you're creating. And that allows you to do some of what we were talking about earlier, which is like you want other people spreading the word and working on those algorithms so that you can win in your content marketing strategy.
Yeah, for us, it's going to be a lot of educational content and partnering with brands that want to really power our community. So, how can we work with an Intel to create a series of, members only or even public facing educational based content that helps them solve a specific challenge. Very big on the customization, listening to people telling us, my challenge is finance and scale. My challenge is productivity, and then customizing the content specifically to what they need. Webinars have been really big for us, but they've been gated in the past. So we've been doing Crowdcast, which we really like. But now we're going to start either tapping into LinkedIn Live, Facebook Live, Instagram Live, and looking at how to really tease out that webinar content in smaller bite-sized ways and make it something that's more available to everyone.
Fabulous.
Yeah, those are all great. I do think that in some industries, it's almost a post-digital transformation world. We've done that. It's fully digital. And I think in those spaces in particular, I'm hearing people talk about more in real life events. So the idea that you have here, I think that's really resonating, especially in industries that have been very digital forward. So we're looking at more events where we're talking with people as well.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to turn it over to the audience. But yes, let's give a round of applause. Thank you. So when you're doing a newsletter, do you recommend doing multiple articles or focusing on one? Because I feel like a lot of newsletters don't get open, especially with how you receive them. You can't see the pictures, you can't see the content. Like I've seen ones that you just get an article, like the title in a short article and you can read it. So what do you guys recommend? Great question. Best practices.
I think it depends on your objective. So for example, many publishers will have you click through to the website to read the full content, right? And so what's their objective? They might want you to go to the full page and see some ads. If you're getting an email where you're getting full content in that email or dedicated newsletter, the goal might be that they want you to keep engaging with that newsletter, right? And they want to drive, engagement there. I think it really depends on what your strategy is. What I would definitely recommend is A/B testing and trying new things, and then looking at the analytics to see how it performs.
I just want you guys to talk a little bit more about how you decide what content to use. And some of you touched on this. I think there was mention of sort of looking at keyword opportunities, where the competitors are weak and strong, where you could rank. But in terms of, I think one of the challenges that brands are facing today is to be customer centric, but not to the point where you have brand dilution. So how do you sort of make the right content decisions? What's the calculus in sort of your thinking with your brand? How do you make the right decisions about what content, what micro topics to use that are going to not just give you a short-term blip in readership, but also but sort of carve out a long-term brand profile for you in terms of that.
Let's hear from Peter. Peter, and specifically around the travel company that you're launching. What content are you trying?
Yeah, so for me, it's really related to kind of like cheap flight content. So I created a way to provide very, very low cost flights to individuals. So that is my pillar. So everything has to relate back to that. So any piece of content I create that's going to bring in a prospective traveler who's going to find value from my core product, I'm going to speak to those themes. But everything for me is.
Can you give us a few examples of the themes?
Yeah. For instance, I'm focusing on international travel. So, what are the checklists when you go to a particular locale? So there were $200 flights round trip to Madrid from New York. So I'm going to create a lot of content around Madrid and, destinations in Madrid, how to plan a vacation to Madrid, all things that have search volume and relate that back to the core value of my service.
I'm curious, just this man also added a kind of long-term value in relationship with the client. So do you worry about these pieces of content being kind of short-term and they're not going to, what do you have to serve them next?
So I have a long-term and short-term approach. So if I bring somebody in off of short-term content, then I'm going to start utilizing interstitials. I'm going to figure out a way to capture them and understand how they came into the site, content that they're interested in, and serve them content that is related. So back at the days at the Muse, if I know that you're looking at interview questions, I know you probably applied to some jobs. I know that you're either going to, move on in this interview process, or you're not. You fail at it. You're going to take a step back. And I have, ways to interact with that user. So it's just thinking about the journey, thinking about what that user is going to expect and what they're potentially going to experience. Then you build content around that.
Katya, quick question. You said that you are starting to serve up content that helps people with their specific pain points. So I think you gave a few examples around building business. How do you serve with that kind of specific content?
Yeah, so for us, that's happening in the member application. When members apply, they'll actually tell us their stage of business and what they're struggling with. And with that data, then we'll use HubSpot to basically map them back to specific content that solves it. So for example, if a member joins and she's just launched, we have that as a field, 1 year, we're going to serve her content that basically is all about startup stories within that first year. Just like meeting people where they are. We actually have that data because they're going through a pretty in-depth application, and so this is for a smaller group of users than say like a larger readership. But I think there are ways to get that, whether it's through HubSpot or just asking people like, what are you most interested in, and then really segmenting your list so that they're just getting what they care about is going to help a lot with engagement.
And do you refer to existing content that you have, or do you have it developed for each of these paths?
We have such a library of content that
Okay.
we're really just repackaging it up and then customizing who gets it, and then being a lot more strategic on any new content that we create for that kind of longer form research. We're doing a lot of research on, the motherhood advantage and what it's like to be a working mom today and all the financial pressures on these women. But that's going to take a lot of time. Meanwhile, we have all these interviews that I think would be really great for someone that's struggling with late stage scaling. And we have 25 interviews on late stage scaling that we can segment out over the year, so they feel like they're trusting when they get a newsletter from Hey Mama, it's going to have a story in there with a woman that they really could see within themselves.
My main challenge is that as like a beauty brand and not kind of a professional source of content, right? I don't provide things that help advance a career or business. How do you create authentic, meaningful, value-providing content that's not salesy and that's not just an excuse to then make a sale, if that makes sense? How do you find out what brand consumers want to hear?
Advice, yeah.
On the beauty side, we have a lot of members that have started beauty companies, and I think the key is finding that one thing that's really unique about how you tell your story. So maybe it doesn't have to be creating the quantity of content, but finding that unique story angle where you're tapping into how a specific woman uses it throughout her day, or something that's really relatable, that's kind of unexpected, and then just being consistent with that across multiple people. Because people they want to see themselves and they want to see a use case. Like maybe it's a Subway makeup competition where, you get in the back of the cab and like people show how they're able to do it, and it's for all these women on the go, and it becomes this, you build a hashtag around it, and it's just one thing that you do that people start getting really excited for. So that's my suggestion.
I think there's a theme here about, bottom line, always knowing your voice, but, one path is kind of doing every piece of content right and meticulously. And there's another path where it's, being kind of the winner of the content in the space. And not every company can do both.
But like being really honest, like you're not going to get everything right. So like it's okay to like do some like content that doesn't work. Like you should be trying lots of things and figuring out what's not working and moving on.
If I'm looking for short form educational content written by subject experts or thought leaders, and the topics are across the board and they're somewhat controversial or somewhat trendy, where do you suggest I go?
I mean, controversial and trendy performs on social, right?
Something like, just for an instance, like gun control or immigration, for instance, and where you have two-sided issues, trying to be able to get both sides of the issue represented.
I mean, I think it's so interesting, right? Because especially with a short form, you might not be talking about an area where you need to hire a freelancer and do like something that's going to require a certain level of expertise. I think what you're talking about is opinions and experiences, correct? And so like you have such an opportunity to reach out within the community and almost recruit and ask those people to participate with you. And I think for people in those specific spaces, they feel so passionately, they want to be engaged. You have an opportunity to do that outreach and engage them. Often, if you look on social, and I think especially you probably experience this with influencer, you might look at who are the voices in this space and who do you feel is quality. I think quality can mean a lot of different things to a lot of people. Right? And so I think being able to go and do the research and curate based on what you're seeing on social might get you a little bit closer.
Susan, you were going to say something?
Oh, I was just going to suggest curating from both sides of that. So if you're doing the research that Sharon described, go ahead and use that to create a blog post. These are the opinions that we see on this side. These are the opinions that we see on this side. And then you can repurpose that way too.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone, for your insights. My question is, you're trying to curate content that is mostly about your product or service, but you also have other things that you want to showcase in your content. Where do you draw the line or the balance between the two, say telling a company story or values versus focusing on a totally product or the service?
I might actually point out somebody in the audience who might get really embarrassed. So Rachel Zisser-Kaplowitz is in the audience, and she's the CEO of Honey. I think her and her team do a really good job of this. She happens to be somebody you should talk to. She is an awesome kick-ass mom of 2 kids, and she is a thought leader. And so she sort of melds those 2 things along with product updates on the Honey blog, in addition to on social. And I think what's really cool is that, in finding that balance of like her thought leadership, her as a human who's a woman and a mom who's leading this company, and then sort of what's happening in the space, she's sort of like, one, appealing to people who want those different things, finding reach, right? Because those are unique stories. I think when we talk about content, one of the things you have to be really wary of is there's lots of companies and lots of voices. How do you not be like very vanilla? And so, yeah.
Yeah, I think there were moments in the past where we were worried about putting something out that felt too much about us. But then we decided to try it and see if it worked. And so we did a piece about like what we look for in our community members. And at first, when I saw the pitch, I was like, oh, this feels like so salesy. Are people really going to want to read this? But the purpose of the content actually was also just to include it in a lot of emails with people that had this question. So maybe sometimes your content's going to get a ton of traffic, but maybe sometimes it just answers questions that you are constantly getting asked. And you can use that link to just really explain to people exactly what you feel about a specific portion of your product or how it's working or, what works best. So that was a huge eye opener that we could just create content to answer big FAQs. And, it was successful for that purpose of clarifying big questions.
Sharon, you talked about when you work with partners that you can share leads. Where do your concerns come in where GDPR compliance for those lists kick in?
So 1, I recommend familiarizing yourself with GDPR. 2, I think it's really important to be transparent with your users. So making sure that when you're creating programs where you're exchanging information, or contests are a really big one. In previous roles, I've been very wary of contests because you have to make sure that you're checking lots of boxes. Making sure that you're documenting, creating transparency for people who are participating and making sure that it's accessible, right? So you want to make sure that if you're publishing something on a website that people can find it.
When we're doing webinar series with partners, we just ask in the registration, do you want to hear more from BuzzSumo? Do you want to hear more from Name a Partner? Because our company is based in the UK, so that's how we've worked it out with webinars. Everyone gets the replay, and then after that, unless you checked that box, you don't hear anything else from us.
Ram.
Hi, we are a health startup, and we are planning to create a lot of educational content in the health space, but we have not raised bootstrapping. Creating video is expensive. Any ideas on doing it at a low cost with value?
I think going back to the concept that video can mean a lot of things, right? And I think it's important to say content can be really overwhelming. It's like sometimes it's just hard to get started. Find your start, right? And so an example might be like LinkedIn, just video with a phone. As the founder or the CEO, just like recording yourself, seeing what happens, seeing who participates, and thinking about not the production value of what you're putting out into the world, but rather like, what are you saying?
Get a good mic. I seriously, I would invest in the mic and everything else, a Diva Light, you're good to go.
I want to thank BetaWorks again, and I want to thank Ripe for the delicious food. And thank you for sharing your evenings and all of your insights with us. We really appreciate your being here. So one more round of applause.